We've got about 30 minutes until the start of trading. Welcome to Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Sonali Basak.
And I'm Katie Greifeld. Of course, two of the biggest stories in markets this morning are last night's presidential debate and this morning's CPI print. Markets clearly responding to the latter right now. You look at pricing with about 30 minutes to go until the opening bell. The S&P 500 down about 0.2%. The NASDAQ 100 back to unchanged, of course, in the futures market. Interestingly, you take a look at the 10-year yield, up a little bit, 3 basis points. The real action is in the 2-year Treasury yield, of course, up about 6 basis points to 7 basis points right now as traders really trim back their bets on a 50 basis point rate cut. Right now, we're priced for about 29 basis points of easing at next week's Fed meeting. On August 5th, we were pricing in 49 basis points of Fed cuts. So clearly a bit of a rethink going on in this morning's trade.
Yeah, the 2-year, of course, going to be most sensitive to any change in expectations for rate cuts. We've got a fantastic lineup of guests to talk us through the inflation data as well as the presidential debate last night. We're going to kick it off with former Bridgewater chief strategist Rebecca Patterson. Omair Sharif of Inflation Insights is going to join us to give us his take, and Henrietta Treyz of Veda Partners joins us, as well as CEO Howard Lutnick, very close to the tragedy of 9/11, as well as the presidential election right now, because he will be Donald Trump's, if Trump wins, he'll be the co-head of his transition team.
And it's really interesting. He's actually with Trump and J.D. Vance this morning down in Lower Manhattan. But to that end, you have to wonder what is going to drive the narrative now. Many people thought the presidential debate was really what would set the stage, but you had that CPI surprise, and it really comes down to shelter costs. We know this is a politicized issue in this environment.
Right.
There are still at least 50 basis points of rate cuts priced in to later this year after the election for both sets of meetings.
Well, shelter costs, of course, rising by 0.5%. That was a big surprise. Of course, Constance Hunter on Bloomberg Radio highlighting that that's a problem for the Fed. What's interesting, though, is this move in core. You have to wonder how much this really factors into what the Fed feels like right now, because the room temperature of inflation is coming down, but clearly this report showing that it's not completely extinguished.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought of it as a big surprise myself, since it's only 0.3%.
You've got to go out on the decimal
How much
points.
control do they have over housing at the end of the day?
Yeah, we'll get into all of that, the nitty-gritty of the inflation numbers, as well as how the Fed could or should react to that on September 18th. But, of course, we're going to be talking about the debate front and center. Also, it is September 11th. Today marks the 23rd anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks that hit New York City and Pennsylvania, as well as Washington, D.C. in 2001. We honor the victims, first responders, and all of those around the world impacted on that very day with a moment of silence in observance when United Flight 175 struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center.
And my and my grandfather, FDNY Captain James J. Corrigan. We love you so much and we miss you so much. Me and my 3 sisters wish we got to meet you.
Gary Eugene Bird.
Joshua David Birnbaum.
George John Bishop.
Chris Romeo Bishundat.
Jeffrey Donald Bittner.
Albert Belayla Blackman Jr.
Christopher Joseph Blackwell.
Carrie Rosetta Blackburn.
Susan Leigh Blair.
This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's take a look at where markets are trading. Less than 30 minutes to go until the bells ring. You can see a bit of a recovery underway in the pre-market. The S&P 500 before the bell rings currently flat on the day. We had been lower. Same story, too, if you look at the NASDAQ 100. A more dramatic move there. Of course, big tech going from negative on the day to up about 0.2% as markets work through, of course, that CPI data that we got at 8:30 Eastern, showing a little bit of a surprise to the upside on core inflation, but still looks like we're shrugging it off, at least in the equity market. The bond market, an interesting story as well. The 10-year yield of about 3 basis points, but the 2-year yield, where you should really be focusing your attention, Matt, currently up about 6-7 basis points.
All right, for more on that inflation data, we're joined by Michael McKee, Bloomberg's chief international economics and policy correspondent. So, Mike, a little bit of a jump. I guess it could be looked at as a big surprise to the upside on the month-over-month core number, but everything else is bang in line and inflation looks pretty tame.
It does, and it is. At this point, the numbers that pushed inflation higher on a core basis come from housing, as you mentioned, up 0.5% during the month, and from airfares, which were up 3.9% during the month. Kind of volatile figures, and the Fed, of course, can't really affect the housing in numbers at all. So as you can see, we are still on the inexorable path down towards 2%, and that's on an annual basis, which includes inflation a year ago that nobody cares about right now. On a 3-month basis, we're at 1.1% and on the headline and 2.4% on the core. So the trend is clearly lower and lower and lower. And as you mentioned, we are seeing a change on Wall Street in their thinking about what the Fed's going to do. We are now down to a 25 basis point cut. 29 basis points is the futures priced in. And so we're not looking at this point like 50 basis points is expected by anybody anymore after this CPI report. One other thing I want to mention, because you talked about, Katie, at the top of the show, the two important things this morning were the CPI and last night's debate. Last night's debate, there was talk of food prices. Food prices completely flat during the month. There was also talk of bacon prices. Bacon prices were down big. And of course, if you need to replace, say, your pets, pet prices are down.
There you go. Pet prices are down.
Why would you need to replace your pets?
That's the thing. There's not a lot of turnover in those numbers, I imagine.
Unless someone's been eating them, right?
He was definitely waiting to say that for hours this morning. Anyways, Michael McKee, we thank you so very much for your analysis. We now have Rebecca Patterson, former Bridgewater Associates Chief Investment Strategist, joining us now. A little less on the pet prices, a little more on kind of the undertone there. There's politics and policy, and then there's the actual numbers we see in the data here. If we kind of sit here today and kind of incrementally rewrite the narrative into the end of the year, what's going to matter going into that Fed meeting and into the election?
So I think the inflation today at the margin is tilting investors towards 25 basis points in September. And then the question is, do we get 25, 50, the final 2 meetings of the year? It will depend on the data. I know that's a horrible answer, but it's true. I think the bigger deal is going to be next year. I think there's 2 big question marks around the market pricing for Fed funds next year, which is still, even after the CPI, we're looking at total between now and the end of next year, about 250 basis points of rate cuts next year priced into the market. So one question is the election. If former President Trump were to win a second term, I think the market is perceiving that that would be relatively more inflationary. That could slow the Fed down with rate cuts. So that's an important factor. He would probably need a sweep for that to be truly impactful. But even without a sweep, he could push forward on trade policy, on immigration policy.
Yeah, it does look like the most inflationary aspects of his plan are the ones that he could push through himself.
Correct, without Congress.
Yeah.
But then the second factor that I don't think is getting enough attention is the transmission of monetary policy. How smoothly does it flow through to the economy? And with so many mortgages, 60% of mortgages locked in below 4%, and with so many corporations, especially larger corporations, with long-term fixed low borrowing costs, it might take quite a bit of easing to start see that support, if you will, come through to the consumer and the business sector.
Well, there's a lot to dig into there, of course. When you think about the politics, who knows what's going to happen? Of course, the polling going into this was 50-50. It's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out. But you make the point in your notes that the Fed can't anticipate what's going to happen. They have to react to the data that we have on the ground. So you think about the numbers that we got at 8:30. You think about, you go through, of course, what we learned with shelter, pets even, and food. And one of the arguments that people in the 50 basis point camp were making was that basically policy rates north of 5% are way too restrictive for where we actually are. So you extrapolate that forward. I mean, how much easing outside of politics do you think that this Fed has to put through before it starts to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we heard last week from Williams and Waller, what we've heard from Chair Powell, is that they agree. The policy rate is very restrictive. It is time, given the inflation data, given the labor market softening, for them to move closer to neutral. The question, I think, that I don't think is resolved yet is what is the speed of that easing to get back to neutral? And then what is neutral? I think there's still debate on what the long-term neutral rate is. Now, the September...
And always will be.
Of course.
Yeah.
The September meeting will be important because we will get a new set of dots from the Fed, a set of forecasts from the Fed. So we'll see if there's any incremental change in their thinking. But again, the election next year could matter in terms of affecting our thinking on long-term neutral.
Well, and maybe in terms of Fed policy, right? They don't want to look like they're supporting the Biden-Harris administration. And a 50 basis point cut, I think Donald Trump himself may put out a post on Truth Social saying that the Fed is in the Biden White House camp.
They're going to get politicized no matter what they do. I would put my hand on my heart saying they don't care about the politics. They're going to do what they think is right for the economy and their dual mandate. But I hear you. Whatever they do, one party or the other will try to spin it.
Well, Rebecca, hang tight for a minute here. Let's get deeper into the politics because Americans got a clearer picture on the policy outlook for Harris and Trump at last night's debate. Here's how they targeted each other's records.
We've had a terrible economy because inflation which is really known as a country buster. It breaks up countries. We have inflation like very few people have ever seen before, probably the worst in our nation's history. We were at 21%, but that's being generous because many things are 50, 60, 70, and 80% higher than they were just a few years ago.
His plan is to do what he has done before, which is to provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations, which will result in $5 trillion to America's deficit.
And Bloomberg's David Gura is in Philly with more color on the ground. And David, bring us into the spin room after the debate concluded last night. What was the mood music like?
You know, we had surrogates from both candidates there in the room almost immediately afterward. In fact, some got there before this debate even wrapped up. Both sides eager to claim victory in that debate yesterday. And they wanted to talk about the economy. This was something that came up before the debate. I talked to Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina. He said this is what Vice President Harris had to emphasize during that debate. He and I spoke again after the debate. He was pleased with what she had to say. You know, this was a policy point that she really wanted to stress and did stress during that debate at the beginning and at the end. And I think if you look at Donald Trump and the way that he comported himself during the course of this, yes, he talked about inflation. Yes, there were economic issues that came up, but it was a decidedly less disciplined candidate than we saw back in June in Atlanta. There were moments, there were opportunities when he could have talked about his tax policy plans. He could have talked about the economy in specific. He elected not to do that over the course of the debate, and I think that there was some frustration among his surrogates last night that he didn't stay as focused as he did during that first debate against current President Biden. And what we saw over the course of it, over the course of the evening, was Vice President Harris very effectively baiting him over the course of that debate to sort of move beyond, again, policy specifics, in targeting her record even, to talk about things that we know animate him and he likes to talk about, that are things that his advisors, his chief advisors, do not want him to talk about. So again, that was so effectively done back in Atlanta. I think a lot of people were surprised by the way that he maintained a disciplined posture in that debate. That was certainly not the case last night, guys.
All right, David Gura, thanks very much. We're going to check back in with you in just a few minutes. I want to get back to Rebecca Patterson of Bridgewater here on set. It was interesting to me that because we just saw him last Wednesday at the ECNY, and he was so composed and in control and stayed on point. And this was not that same president. He did a horrible.
Reading off the teleprompter, one of my sources say. So
of course, he's reading. Of course, he's reading off the teleprompter.
Off the he
but
broke
yes,
the script.
It's Donald Trump, right? I'm just saying he did a very good job.
Yeah.
You know, in editorializing a little bit at the ECNY, and he was not the same person. He was more like, you know, your wacky grandmother that spends too much time on Facebook last night.
Also editorializing.
Yeah, of course, but does it? Yeah, because he's saying things like people are eating cats and dogs, and these so many bold-faced lies just continually, that she's going to ban fracking on day one, that she's a Marxist, that he had nothing to do with January 6th. Does it matter, though, Rebecca? I mean, how much do presidential elections matter to investors?
Right now, the media, all media, are very focused on the election because it does create a large amount of uncertainty between now and November. We'll find out when we learn who the president is. I don't know if it'll be the morning of the 6th. It might take a few days. But in the grand scheme of things, if we look over the next 2, 4, 10 years, the policies coming from the government are a factor, but not the only factor, right? So it matters, but we shouldn't be overplaying it. We have to care about monetary policy. We have to care about global growth, not just growth in the U.S. We have to care about industry trends, what happens with technology and AI here in the United States, regulation. All of these things are what drive the market, not just the politics. So yes, we should focus on it. Trump, especially if he wins, if he has a sweep, that's going to be a meaningful policy change, which I think is going to increase bond issuance, increase inflation, push up bond yields. The tax cuts might be supportive for earnings, but there's a lot of opposing forces here. I'm not sure that he would necessarily be better for the economy. We're going to see that play out in the short term in the betting markets. We see that in the financial markets today as well, a little bit. But I think as we go ahead, if Harris wins and it's a divided Congress, which seems like the more likely outcome if she wins because of the Senate, I think the policy changes are going to be incremental. Rebecca, and so it won't matter as much.
Beyond investors as well, we had this debate last night. We had everyone's take on the debate. At the end of the day, it's a finite number of swing states that are going to matter most in this election.
Yep.
Did she move the needle with any of those voters enough, despite how yesterday went?
I think it's too early to know if she's changed any swing state votes, but I think your point is a valid one that needs to be underscored, that at the end of the day, this election is going to be about 7 states and really probably a few counties in a few of those states. So it's going to be tens of thousands of voters who decide the election, and what they care about most are things that the Fed necessarily can't fix in the short term, right? Housing supply, the cost of housing, the cost of living. And so the election is going to matter a lot in terms of making those voters happy or not. But have we changed their minds from the debate? I don't know yet.
All right, Rebecca, great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us on this really important morning. Rebecca Patterson is going to stick around and stay on this program. Of course, down at the New York Stock Exchange and at the NASDAQ, we're going to continue to honor those that we lost on September 11th, 23 years ago. Those exchanges are now going to observe a moment of silence in order to remember the 9/11 terror attacks that shut down trading and, more importantly, killed so many colleagues and loved ones, as well as first responders. Let's join in.
Welcome back to Open Interest. We're back now with Rebecca Patterson. She is former Bridgewater Associates Chief Investment Strategist. Obviously, a big focus on CPI and a big focus on politics right now after last night's debate. And there are elements of day trading going on today, both in the prediction markets and in the stock market. Shares of DJT currently down about 15.5% pre-market. But from the investor's perspective, if you have a medium-term, long-term outlook, how should you be thinking about what we're going to get in November?
I mean, history shows us, and I think this time is not different, that the months leading into an election tend to be bumpier because you have greater levels of uncertainty around what policy is going to be. Once you get through the election and you have more clarity on policy, equity markets, assuming the economy is not going into recession or in recession, tends to do better. So I think if I'm positioning for the next 50 whatever days left, we have 6 or so, and maybe even a few days after the election. Remember, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania don't start counting votes till the day of the election. It could take a few days. Plus, we're going to have a lot of validating of votes. It could be days or even weeks before we actually know who the president is. So I think you want to be positioned defensively for this next stretch into early November. And I think that includes things like staying in large caps rather than small caps, even though the Fed is cutting rates. I think that includes gold. I think that includes treasuries. And if you want to look outside of the United States, UK stocks, incredibly cheaply valued, not owned, and very defensive. They have a lower beta, if you will, than a lot of other markets.
Is it, and I'm going to ask this question to our next guest as well because she likes big cap tech stocks, but is that trade a little bit too crowded? Hadn't we seen that when the yen, and I think yesterday the yen hit a high for the year and erased all its losses. When the carry trade gets unwound, those stocks get hit, and that whole herd, piles out of those stocks.
I mean, there's a lot of things buffering the mega cap tech stocks right now. The yen carry unwind potentially, as well as regulatory hits from Europe and the United States. And then to your point, it's still a crowded trade. Valuations have come down, but you're still looking at valuations around 30 versus the S&P, which is closer to 21. I'm talking about an aggregate for the big tech. And so much good news is priced in that you don't need much disappointment to see things fall, as we've seen with recent earnings. I still like big cap tech over the medium and long term, but I agree over the very short term, if people are getting more defensive, more cautious into this election, that might be another casualty.
Well, Rebecca, really appreciate you sticking with us this morning. Great to speak to you again. Hope to do it again soon. That is Rebecca Patterson. Of course, she is Bridgewater Associates' former chief investment strategist. Now, just 4 minutes to go until the opening bell, the start of trading on CPI Day. We'll kick it off with State Street head of equity research, Marija Veitmane. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
We are just moments away from the start of trading. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm Matt Miller. It's fascinating to me that after we get CPI data, the once all-important inflation data point, and the day after a presidential debate so important that markets are so calm. S&P futures are essentially unchanged going into that bell. NASDAQ futures up about 0.2%. Yes, we had some move, especially at the front end of the curve in terms of bond yields, but otherwise things seem relatively placid. Here at the New York Stock Exchange, of course, we are going to mark the 23rd anniversary of September 11th. Down at the NASDAQ, Tuesday's children, and they're going to do the same thing. Throughout this program, we have been and will continuing to be honoring those who lost their lives on that fateful day in 2001. Right now, let's get over to Katie Greifeld. She's going to give us a check in the early seconds of trading on the day averages. Katie?
Yeah, 36 seconds in. You can see, like you said, a bit of calm, but still mixed markets right now. The S&P 500, we had gotten back to unchanged. Now we're dipping a little bit as those bells ring. The NASDAQ 100 trying to hold on to gains here, currently up about 0.1%. Certainly not smooth sailing if you take a look over at the small caps, with the Russell 2000 currently down about 0.5%. If you look under the hood, of course, there is some trading happening around policy politics right now, and that's happening in Trump media and technology shares. Ticker DJT shares absolutely falling after the debate last night, currently down about 14% right now. And of course, Sonali, the stock has fallen about 60% since May.
More moving under the hood here. Some earnings movers. GameStop under pressure despite reporting a surprise profit. Net sales missed estimates, and GameStop now down about 11.5% at the open. You also have Dave & Buster's soaring more than 11.7% higher after adjusted EPS and margin performance impressed. Remember, this was a stock that had a tough year, but things are starting to turn around a bit, Matt.
Also keep an eye on renewable energy and green energy stocks. They are moving higher after the debate last night. Kamala Harris has been, of course, a proponent of the Inflation Reduction Act, which Donald Trump says he wants to roll back entirely. But you do see, I think this is just one more indicator of Harris winning that debate. You know, obviously, different people are going to have different opinions.
Right.
CNN did a poll. 63% of those respondents said they thought Harris won the debate. You could say CNN, the people who they're polling are likely center left because, you know, they are. But
it's interesting to see that pair trade going on in markets, of course, highlighting DJT's plummet, of course, highlighting the rally that you're seeing in the green energy stocks. Clearly, there's some movement there.
Trump did say that he likes solar, remember?
There you go.
He
That's
said
true.
It's horrible. He likes it.
A pair trade,
But,
nonetheless.
yeah.
Let's bring this conversation over to State Street head of equity research, Marija Veitmane, who's joining us now. And of course, we want to get to your big tech call, but let's start with the news of the day, because of course, we're all talking about the presidential debate last night. Then you get 8:30 a.m. the CPI data on a core basis coming in a little bit hotter on a monthly basis. Where are you taking your cues from right now?
Yeah, hello, and thank you for having me today. I mean, for us, by far, the most important indicator is that what's happening with economy, so economic activity, recession on, recession off, that seemed like to be front and center of our calls. I actually have to say that recent messages from the Fed were really supportive for equity market, equity investors. Like Chairman Powell and Jackson Hole told us that he's focused on labor market and he sees it as non-inflationary. So good news on economy, good for stocks. Bad news on economy, also not terrible. So I think that's kind of the broad medium-term setup for us. So fairly constructive.
When you look at the movement in the bond market at this juncture and the hopes kind of diminishing here for that 50 basis point cut in September, of course, there are many that still believe you might get more 50 basis point cuts in the rest of this year. Does that really change the calculus and how you're discounting equities right now, particularly the growth ones?
I mean, maybe not particularly. I mean, it's probably more important to think about kind of the cuts over the cycle, and their markets seem to be fairly kind of fairly constructive in terms of like, okay, we expect a fairly significant rate cutting cycle over like year and a half. So that's I guess probably more important than exact detail of like front loading or how many cuts and when. So I think it's overall kind of discounting cuts over cycle.
I mean, if we get cuts, do we not then see a broadening out of earnings that follows, Marija? And does that not mean you could rotate into, you know, smaller cap names? Because obviously, you know, the Mag 7 were taking all the air out of the room, but that really seems to have changed in terms of this earnings season and could continue.
I mean, that's obviously a million-dollar question. I think that's a question I get asked more often than any other question. When do we buy small caps? And I think you're right. For the rally to broaden, what you need to see is broadening out of earnings, and we haven't seen it yet. And if anything, all those recessionary concerns, they're weighing a lot more on small caps. So yes, small caps will potentially get some kind of relief from lower interest rate, but the reason Fed is cutting rates is that underlying economic pressure, and they really felt a lot stronger in small caps and their earnings expectations. So no, not yet. I think the first kind of small caps, you go for quality. That's an indication. Okay, we have a problem where earnings are scarce, where the earnings are more sustainable, where do we see quality, where do we see less margin pressure.
All right, Marija, thanks so much for joining us. Marija Veitmane there, State Street head of equity research, talking to us about markets on such an important day, not only because we got that inflation data out, and I guess that means maybe a little bit less than it did over the last couple of years. But we had this debate last night that I think most people stayed up and watched the whole debate. But more importantly, it is September 11th. It's been 23 years since terror attacks that killed thousands of Americans. And as a result, we are honoring those fallen at the New York Stock Exchange and at the NASDAQ market site. We're going to take a moment of silence right now in observance with those two marketplaces of the time when American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon. So we saw damage in New York, in Pennsylvania, and in Washington, D.C., across the country, and the whole world will never forget.
However, your siblings and parents will always make sure to share your stories for you. Through us, your family, will make sure you are never forgotten and your legacy will live on. Tito, wherever you are, I hope you finally found peace. Mahal na mahal kita.
This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's take a look at how stocks are faring. About 11 minutes into the trading day, you can see that slight gains have turned into losses. The S&P 500 currently down about 0.5%. You can see the NASDAQ 100 flat on the day, but we had been talking about gains earlier for big tech. No longer. And then you take a look at your small caps. That is your biggest loser right now. That's the state of play. The small cap index currently down about 0.7%. Let's turn now to our top calls, though. Some of the analyst action that's in focus this morning. And first up, Goldman Sachs says that Morgan Stanley is no longer a buy. Analysts at the firm are cutting their recommendation to neutral, saying that the bank has less recovery than peers in the investment banking divisions and cites risks to its earnings growth. Next up, you have Jefferies saying that Williams-Sonoma is a buy, raising its rating on the home goods retailer from hold. The analyst over there says that the company is outperforming industry growth while also cutting back on promotions. And finally, Citi saying that Charter Communications no longer a sell, upgrading the telecom company to a neutral, raising its price target as well. The analyst says that the core operating environment in broadband, quote, seems stable, but you can see shares currently down about 0.6%, Matt.
All right, let's get back to last night's debate. Both candidates attacked each other over the economy, immigration, and their stances on energy. Here's some of the back and forth on fracking and clean energy.
I will not ban fracking. I have not banned fracking as Vice President of the United States. And in fact, I was the tie-breaking vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which opened new leases for fracking.
Fracking? She's been against it for 12 years. If she won the election, the day after that election, they'll go back to destroying our country, and oil will be dead, fossil fuel will be dead. We'll go back to windmills, and we'll go back to solar, where they need a whole desert to get some energy to come out. You ever see a solar plant?
Well, he did follow that by saying he does also love solar. Joining us now is Bloomberg's David Gura in Philadelphia. David, it did seem like Kamala Harris had him on the back foot from the very start, and it was interesting, I think, that she said, I was behind fracking, I support fracking, I'm for Pennsylvanian fracking, and then he followed with a retort, she'll ban fracking on day one.
Yeah, I mean, she knew going into this debate this was going to be something that the former president was going to bring up here in the state of Pennsylvania. We had kind of a preview of that from statements that the former president had made. So she'd obviously prepared for that, and what she's emphasized over these last few weeks is that maybe some of her policy positions have changed, but her values have not. And I think it was just an example, one of many during the course of this debate, where she was able to kind of artfully pivot on the one hand, but also get him to kind of pivot from what he wanted to be saying in that moment. This isn't what he wanted to be talking about. He could have doubled down more. He could have talked more about these inconsistencies in her plans since she ran back in 2019 and 2020. She kind of threw him off rather over the course of this on energy. I think of abortion as another issue here. I mean, he began that answer on abortion, on reproductive rights, by talking about how this should be left to the states. Okay, a fair answer and a thoughtful answer and perhaps a sound policy answer from the Republican side. But then that devolved into kind of conspiracy theories, so much so that the moderators of this debate interjected and said that there's no factual grounds to back up what the former president was saying. So you're right, there was a lot of baiting, a lot of needling that was proved quite effective over the course of the debate for Vice President Harris.
At the end of the day, you looked at the outcomes and the reactions, and the betting markets really swayed Harris in the immediate aftermath, but the betting markets are not the polling markets. And if you think about the polls itself and where it matters most for Harris, was there any indication, David, that anything she said would sway any of the voters that were so firmly voting for Trump already in those swing states?
So this is a debate, I think, that was largely centered on style more so than substance. And going into this debate, I think the vice president knew that it was incumbent on her to introduce herself to those voters who are still undecided. And we're talking about thousands of voters across this country, not a huge number of them, and not just in swing states, but in swing districts. So she's made that appeal. But I think back on what I heard from Governor Gavin Newsom of California before this debate. I said, what does she have to do tonight? How important is this debate? And he said, think of this more like World War I, where it's going to be decided by inches. We were not going to see a giant jump in the polls as a result of that, nor are we going to see somebody sink in the polls as a result of this debate as well. I mean, I think it's a success for her in that she stayed on message. She comported herself in a way where I think a lot of people would think that she's calm, collected, presidential, dare I say. That was what she needed to do, and I think, that is going to be effective in some sense, but is it going to be decisive? No. We've still got fewer than 60 days to go till the election. Both of these candidates are going to be on the campaign trail really making the case, again, to that very small sliver of the electorate. And nothing is going to change radically as a result of what happened here in Philadelphia last night.
Well, David, let's talk about one person who was apparently swayed by last night's debate. And I'm talking about Taylor Swift. And it's easy to make jokes here, of course, about her coming out on Instagram, posting a photo with her cat, throwing her support behind Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and signing it as a childless cat lady, of course, referencing J.D. Vance there. But you have plenty of political analysts saying that this could actually make a difference in the polls, in the voting box. I mean, how are people reacting to this on the ground in Philadelphia?
So there were two kind of signal moments in the aftermath of this debate. The first was when Donald Trump came into the spin room. That was unexpected, and I was in the middle of an interview with Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. He and I were talking, and then kind of over my shoulder, I saw just a pack of reporters running by, so they were there to see him. What preceded that, though, was when this endorsement came out on Instagram, and there was just kind of buzz within the spin room about people talking about it. Did you see this? Of course, Tim Walz, the running mate for Vice President Harris, was asked about it when he was on television in real time. It's something that a lot of people wondered about and thought about. You think back on the DNC, there was all this speculation. Would there be a surprise guest? Could that be Beyonce? Could it be Taylor Swift? I think what it highlights is the fact that the Trump campaign, the Trump-Vance campaign, is still being dogged by these remarks that J.D. Vance made when he was running for Senate in Ohio, chief among them this remark about childless cat ladies. It has taken on a life of its own, and I think you're right, Katie. I think that there's a lot of power in this endorsement in kind of a pop culture sense. We'll see how effective that is at sort of swaying people to come over to Vice President Harris's side. But again, it was a big moment. It was a surrogate, from a surrogate who was not in the room last night, but I think had a profound impact on the conversation, the dialogue that was taking place in that room last night.
It did seem like the moderators were posing questions from Kamala Harris's camp, talking about this Trump tax, the idea that his tariffs are actually a tax on consumers, and not really hitting her on her incredibly liberal voting record in Congress. What did people in the press room think about the sort of 3-on-1 aspect of the debate?
It's certainly something that I heard from Republicans I talked to after the debate last night. Michael Whatley, who's the co-chair of the Republican National Committee, making a very similar point. He thought that there was a bit of unfairness there. particularly when it came to the fact-checking that was done in real time on occasion by those moderators as well. But you're right. I mean, there were moments during the course of the debate when they brought up that kind of difference in policy positions when she was running for president versus now, back in 2019 and 2020. But there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on her voting record. So I think it's a fair point in the sense that it's going to be something that's going to be criticized by Republicans and certainly backers of the former president going forward here. But, you know, thinking about the fact-checking in particular, we wondered what it would be like with the microphone muting and all of that, the limitations on what the moderators were supposed to do. Again, I think there were just kind of a handful of moments when things that the former president said were so egregious that these moderators felt like they had to jump in and say something to set the record straight. Abortion's key to that moment in particular, immigration as well. And then the effectiveness of that mute button, I think that they were deploying it more, it seemed, on the vice president than they were on former President Trump. There were many moments over the course of the debate when he interjected and they went to him, he got a little more time for rebuttals.
I wonder, David, where does President Trump get this sort of post-birth execution, lie that he continues to bring up? Because it's not the first time.
No, it's not the first time, and it's something that's been kind of in the zeitgeist of this kind of right-wing, fringe right-wing media. You've heard people talk on talk radio about it. You've seen it on X, on Twitter, and it's something that he has said before over and over again. And again, that was a moment when Lindsay Davis, the moderator from ABC News, said there is no evidence of that happening. There's no evidence of execution of newborns or abortions in the 9th month of pregnancy. So again, it's one of many things that he kind of seized on immigration. It had to do with pets in Springfield, Ohio, things that he's talked about at rallies, brought up kind of as asides, making their way onto this very important stage last night. And I think a lot of people kind of, especially supporters of him, wondering why that was something that he diverged into talking about when there were very, again, concrete policies he could have spoke about instead.
David, thank you so very much for joining us and for all of your coverage. Of course, that is Bloomberg's David Gura reporting from Philadelphia. And coming up, pessimism on Wall Street. JP Morgan echoes Goldman Sachs, guiding expectations downward. That and more on our Wall Street beat. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's take a look at stocks right now because the S&P 500 at session lows, you can see, of course, down about 0.7% right now as we continue to digest what we learned at 8:30. Of course, inflation picking up a little bit on a core basis on a month-over-month measure that's weighing on stocks this morning. The small caps feeling it as well. The NASDAQ 100, your relative outperformer right now, still down 0.4%. And on the S&P 500 level, if you look at the sectors, you have almost every sector down right now, including the financials, Sonali, continuing to be under pressure. Badly beaten. Of course, every single stock in the KBW Financials Index currently down on the day. It's time now for the Wall Street Beat because it's day 3 at Barclays' Global Financial Services Conference in New York, and the forecast has been cloudy so far. Adding to the pessimism, Morgan Stanley was cut to neutral by Goldman analysts on the bank's investment banking outlook. Joining us for the latest on this is Sridhar Natarajan. I did want to start with this Morgan Stanley move because you have their new CEO, Ted Bick, saying that this is going to be an investment banking cycle really leading the way. You're not seeing it yet. And with the elections and with the weakness in private equity, you may not see it for months, will you?
Well, let's start off with the fact that no bank loves seeing a downgrade right after one of their top executives speaks at a conference. For Morgan Stanley to get a downgrade from Goldman Sachs, that hurts even more. But the point is, even as Dan Simkowitz, the co-president of Morgan Stanley, talked up the prospects of the bank longer term over the next 5-10 years, the immediate outlook isn't all that great. Partly in line with what we should expect. But when he comes on stage and reinforces the point that even as deal-making conversations are picking up, you're not going to see that play through in the revenue line, that does give people some reason for pause. And in a year when bank stocks have done well, that does affect the broader index overall. Unfortunately, it hurts Morgan Stanley more than others because they have been the weakest big bank stock all year. They're only up about 2% in 2024 so far.
It's better, or is it better, to get a downgrade from someone else than to downgrade yourself, as we saw yesterday at JP Morgan?
Well, you can probably play that off as, see, we're fair sports. But when it comes to arch rivals, probably not. So I'll say a self-downgrade is better than a rival downgrade.
Well handled.
Shri, thanks so much for joining us. Shri Natarajan there talking to us about Morgan Stanley getting downgraded. And, of course, yesterday, J.P. Morgan, President Pinto came out and warned that we were a little too optimistic there, and the stock cratered down more than 5%. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk the economy and debate with Omair, Sharif, then Henrietta Treyz on politics as well, before an interview capping it all off with Howard Lutnick. Oh, and we also have Henrik Lundqvist.
Stick around for that.
This is Bloomberg.
And my grandfather, Richard J. O'Connor. We will always love and miss you.
Timothy Paul Gilbert.
Paul Stewart Gilbey.
Paul John Gill.
Mark Y. Gillis.
Evan Hunter Gillette.
Ronald Lawrence Gilligan.
Rodney C. Gillis.
Laura Gilley.
John F. Ginley.
Donna Marie Giordano.
Jeffrey John Giordano.
John Giordano.
Stephen A. Giorgetti.
Martin Giovinazzo.
Kumkum Girolamo.
Salvatore Gito.
Cynthia Giugliano.
Man John Balaj.
Diane Gladstone.
Keith Alexander Glasgow.
Thomas Irwin Glasser.
Edmund Glaser.
Harry Glenn.
Barry H. Glick.
Jeremy Logan Glick.
Stephen Glick.
John T. Nazzo.
William Robert Gottschalk.
Michael Gallo Aramella.
Brian F. Goldberg.
Jeffrey G. Goldflam.
Michelle Goldstein.
Monica Goldstein.
Stephen Ian Goldstein.
Ronald F. Galinsky.
Andrew H. Golkin.
Dennis James Gomes.
Enrique Antonio Gomez.
Jose Benvendido Gomez.
Manuel Gomez Jr.
And my husband, Peter Mutos. Thank you to all who keep us safe in the armed forces. And in remembrance of my husband's deceased father, Colonel Gus Mutos, survived by his wife, Lieutenant Colonel Lynette Mutos.
And my brother, firefighter Michael Francis Lynch. Your boys were 6 months and 3 years old when you were murdered. You did a beautiful job, and you should be very proud of them. And you only know what we're going through when it happens to you. Others have empathy. So let's all think about what's happening right now in other countries when barbarians are instilling terror in people. Let's not forget that. This is continuing. This has to stop.
All right, you have been listening to the observance of the fall of the South Tower in Lower Manhattan. We take you now to the moment of silence near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, to observe the crash of hijacked Flight 93.
Thomas E. Burnett, Jr. my sister Georgine Rose Corrigan Marisay. Patricia Cushing.
Wonderful son, brother, father, my cousin, Captain Jason M. Dahl.
Joseph DeLuca.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's take a look at the stock market right now. Of course, 36 minutes into the U.S. trading day, you can see we are at session lows on the S&P 500, down nearly 0.9%. Same, too, if you take a look at big tech. The NASDAQ 100 now down about 0.3%, your relative outperformer today. It's interesting what's going on in the bond market. Of course, the 10-year yield now flat on the day. We had been higher, moving higher across the curve after that CPI print. Not so much right now, back to flat. And it's amazing, Matt. If you take a look at the S&P 500, just 38 stocks are trading in the green right now.
Yeah, a very strong breadth to the downside. So even though we're not seeing, 1%, 2% losses,
we're on our way, though.
We're seeing a real conviction, I guess, is the point behind that selling. And it follows, obviously, the worst start to a month. I can't get over this little factoid. Since data going back to 1953, that's how bad last week was.
Listen, like Katie's been saying, we knew this was always going to be a very tough month in the markets. Now, the question is, how long does it stay tough, given we have that November election? Things will be choppy.
All right, let's get more insight now on how the CPI data that we got this morning will affect markets, will affect the Fed. Omair Sharif joins us, Inflation Insights founder and president. And let me just get your first take on inflation. Only going back 2 significant digits doesn't make it look that bad, 0.3% on the core month over month. How's it look to you?
Yeah, good morning. Look, I think at the end of the day, it was a disappointing reading. We were expecting slightly lower print last month. We've had 0.2 cores now for several months, so jumping back up to 0.3 is certainly disappointing. And some of the underlying details, especially some of the shelter data, was not great. But that said, I think the broader picture is headline inflation is down to 2.5%. Core inflation, we're down to about 3.2% now. So I think the broader picture is still a good one, but I think it's just moving. We've hit a bit of a speed bump, if you will. And Chair Powell's talked about this before, that it's not going to be a straight line down. We've had several good months in a row. We've hit a bit of a road bump here, this month. But I do expect that we'll continue to see better inflation numbers ahead.
What gives you so much faith in that, Omair? Because if you think about some of the components here where things were a little stickier, housing has been a problem. You also have airline prices, and there's a lot of chatter in the industry now, in the airline industry, given the state we are in right now with airlines, that prices could actually move up meaningfully from here. Are there more forces that could make future inflation prints more difficult?
Yeah, let me start with airlines and hotel rates was also another index that was up a lot today. Those, first of all, those are not indexes you want to hang your hat on when you're thinking about where inflation's headed, down the road. They're extremely volatile. Honestly, over the course of the entire year, they tend to kind of balance out, meaning they really don't do a whole lot over the course of the full year, even though month to month you can get a lot of volatility in airfares, a lot in hotel rates. But I would say with respect to airfares, one of the positives is this big decline we've seen in oil prices in recent weeks. That should help to lower jet fuel prices, which should help to some extent lower airfares going forward, even though overall travel demand is still really robust. So I just really wouldn't put a lot of stock in month-to-month movements in these particular types of components. Shelter, you mentioned, that was far and away the most disappointing aspect of this report. We had seen some very, very good readings really all year. We've seen shelter slow down. We hit a bit of a bump in July. And then today was absolutely disappointing. OER accelerating to 0.5 is concerning. What I would say is that we have seen the micro data, the raw data that goes into these indexes, slowed very materially in the second quarter. There's this experimental index called the All-Tenant Repeat Rent Index. It fell from 5.6% to 4% in the second quarter. It tends to lead the CPI by about a quarter or two. So I expect that data should begin to moderate going forward. But I will say today's definitely, calls that view into question because of how strong it was.
And Omair, I mean, the conversations we have about inflation, especially on CPI day, they tend to be very technical, very numbers focused, of course, very academic. But I'm curious how you're thinking about the real feel of inflation, because you take a look under the hood at some of the details that we've gone through. I mean, you had airfares up, you had food costs flat, but an index for meats, poultry, fish, eggs rising 0.8%, and housing costs, as we've been talking about, shelter costs up 0.5%. How do you think the experience of inflation has changed on the ground over the course of the past few months?
Yes, I think we can kind of split this up into two parts. One is the parts of the CPI that do a very good job of capturing what people are seeing on a day-to-day basis. So you mentioned food prices. That's a really great place to start because we know the CPI does a great job in capturing food prices because they're literally going out and scanning the price of items in grocery stores. When you look there, we have slowed down. Remember, we were growing about 11-12% year over year in terms of food prices about a year ago. We've slowed down to 2% now. So I think there you've seen, again, prices are not falling, but that growth rate has really flattened out to sort of a pre-pandemic type pace. That's good news at the grocery store. But there are other items that the CPI doesn't really capture as well, which are obviously hitting consumers' wallets. So, things like your home insurance costs. Those are not really measured in the CPI. It's really much more based, for example, on renter's insurance. So that's a cost where we know it is accelerating. It is on the rise. It's going to keep rising probably over the course of the year. But that homeowner's insurance stuff isn't really captured in the CPI. So there's some elements that clearly are improving dramatically for consumers. And there are others that are worsening that unfortunately don't really show up in the CPI, just given the way that it's constructed. So on balance, I think still good news given the overall index is down at 2.5%. But there are some things in there that consumers clearly are still feeling that we're not necessarily going to see in the CPI.
Oh, consumers are going to be reeling from this. Omair, consumers are going to be reeling from the inflation we've seen over the last couple of years for a generation. I mean, this isn't the kind of thing that turns itself around when the Fed is on point for a year or two, right?
Yeah, look, normally, the only way to get these prices down is deflation, which is a situation that nobody wants to be in, especially the Fed. But we are, where you do tend to see prices come off in areas like energy, for example, is down 4% year over year. So we're seeing relief at gasoline. But a lot of these other prices, services prices, especially where prices have increased, they're unlikely to come down. So this higher level is likely here to stay for the foreseeable future. Now the question is, can we get that growth rate back down to something around 2%? And again, we've made a lot of good progress there, but there's still more work to be done in terms of getting inflation all the way back to 2%.
Omair, it just seems like in just under a minute here, there are a lot of factors here that are outside of the Federal Reserve's control. What are those aspects here that will not be significantly moved, at least in the near term, by a reduction in rates?
Yeah, look, I think shelter is the most obvious one. One is they don't really control anything having to do with housing supply, so that's one element of it. The second is just the methodology of housing and shelter. It's always going to sort of lag what we're seeing in real time in terms of changes in rents. And so that's just not something the Fed can control. That's been with us for a long time. That's a well-known aspect of inflation. But, I think at the same time, the underlying raw data, as I mentioned, is showing that we should continue to see improvement in shelter. It's just been a rough couple of months there. But I do expect that to continue to move lower. So even though the Fed can't control it, I think it's moving in the right direction for them. over the coming months.
Omair, we thank you so very much for your time. That is Omair Sharif, Inflation Insights founder and president. Let's get a look at where stocks are moving this hour. It's a tough tape out there. Here's Abigail Doolittle. Abby.
It is a tough tape, Chanel. If we take a look at the shares of Berkshire Hathaway, down 2.5%. Last time I looked, the worst day in about a week or so, but yet superlative may have moved back toward August, given the size of this decline. Now, this, of course, is a broad measure of the markets, but outpacing the S&P 500's decline. I would argue some of this has to do with the post-debate market weighing in. This is more of a Trump trade stock, given the fact that this entity has one of the highest absolute tax bills in the world. If President Trump, former President Trump, were to be reelected, he's proposing a 15% corporate tax, which would really favor Berkshire Hathaway more so than Kamala Harris's proposed 28% corporate tax. So again, this may be in favor of the Harris trade. In fact, if we take a look at the Harris trade, we're going to see some green on the screen, specifically for First Solar, up 7.3%. Molina Healthcare, which is Medicare, Medicaid, also higher. Interestingly, though, some of those home builders that gear toward first-time home builders and the possibility of that $25,000 down payment for first-time home buyers that Kamala Harris has proposed, well, they are down today. So a little bit of mix here. But where it's not mixed, if we take a look at the actual Trump trade, including DJT, down 15.5%, the worst day since April of this year. We also have Humana, which would be more toward actual insurance plans, down 5.7%. And Rockwell Automation, well, it is down 4.3%. So overall, the Trump trade clearly in the red. The Harris trade a little bit mixed toward the green, and then Berkshire Hathaway down with the markets. But again, Katie, I would suggest that it is down more, potentially because of this Trump trade post-debate.
You're right there, of course. Abigail Doolittle, appreciate the roundup. Highlighting some of the single stocks on a day where almost everything is down. In the S&P 500 right now, only 17 stocks in the green. We'll continue to monitor that. And of course, the political scene, of course, we'll get into last night's debate and a celebrity endorsement of one of the candidates. All of that is next. This is Bloomberg.
Let's get now to high interest to look at what's making headlines around the world. U.S. mortgage rates continued their slide down last week, hitting the lowest level since February of 2023. The 14 basis point drop marked the sixth straight weekly decline, spurring a pickup in refinancing applications and emboldening home buyers. UniCredit's shock move on Commerzbank caught out the German government. The Italian bank is now almost as big a shareholder in the German bank after swooping in for a tranche of shares. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had no advance warning of the move, but Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni did. And Taylor Swift has endorsed Kamala Harris. She made the announcement minutes after the debate wrapped through a social media post featuring her cat, Benjamin Button. She says she's voting for Harris because, quote, she fights for the rights and causes I believe need a warrior to champion them, end quote.
All right, Matt, sticking with the debate, here are some of the takeaways from last night's showdown between Trump and Harris.
Wait a minute, I'm talking now, if you don't mind, please. Does that sound familiar? We have inflation like very few people have ever seen before, probably the worst in our nation's history.
His plan is to do what he has done before, which is to provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations. People start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom.
She said people start leaving. People don't go to her rallies. There's no reason to go. I showed up for a speech. I said, I think it's going to be big.
To attack our nation's capital, the freedom to make decisions about one's own body should not be made by the government.
Well, there she goes again. It's a lie. I'm not signing a ban, and there's no reason to sign a ban because we've gotten what everybody wanted.
Under Donald Trump's presidency, he ended up selling American chips to China to help them.
We hardly make chips anymore. She hates Israel. At the same time, in her own way, she hates the Arab population.
That's absolutely not true. He's trying to, again, divide and distract from the reality.
All right, let's unpack it all now with Veda Partners Economic Policy Research Director, Henrietta Treyz. Henrietta, great to have you with us. Of course, Veda Partners was placing about 60% odds on a Trump win heading into last night's debate. This morning, are you rethinking those?
Well, we really are waiting to see what the swing state voters think. Going into last night, 50% of the electorate thought that Trump was going to win. And at the end of the night, only 30% thought that he actually did. So this was clearly a win for Kamala Harris last night, as the tape is showing. And y'all just went through the segment walking through the upticks in clean energy stock names with the anticipation that Kamala Harris will win. There's only about a 5% basket of American voters who are undecided right now. Only 14% of viewers last night said that they felt like maybe they should rethink their decisions, and then ultimately only 4% of the electorate did. So it highlights the polarization of the country. Fundraising was through the roof for Kamala Harris last night. So we're going to wait to see how that translates to key states like Arizona and Georgia and see if it moves the needle.
To that end, you saw a couple of policy measures here that she swung off the left about. For example, you think about what she said about fracking and the way she framed the energy story here about the lack of reliance on foreign oil. You also think about what she said about her own gun ownership. Henrietta, did she win anybody over here on the other side of the aisle? She talked about her conversation with the Republican Party a lot.
Yeah, it really is phenomenal to see a Democratic candidate on the stage talking about how they and their vice president are gun owners, and they've been endorsed by the former Vice President Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz Cheney. It's a striking turn of events that 10 years ago you would never have expected. She made last night repeated appeals to those independent voters, suburban voters, married voters, more middle class, educated voters, and low education voters to say, look, if you don't like what you're seeing from Donald Trump right now, there is a place for you in my party. And, speaking directly to gun owners, directly to Dick Cheney Republicans, it was a clear overture to those members to say, hey, feel free to come over to my campaign.
Especially for one of the most leftist members of the Senate in history, right? VoteView has ranked her as the second most left-wing member of the Senate after Elizabeth Warren in the 116th and 117th Congresses. And going back to 1824, only 15 senators have a voting record that's to the left of hers. Has she really swung to the center in the last 4 years?
Well, I think if you do yourself a favor to look at what that data set consists of. She wasn't a senator for very long, so she didn't take that many votes, which is why her standing on the liberal end appears the way it does. But to take, a 28% corporate tax rate position, which is the same as Obama and Biden's, to take an even lower 28% capital gains tax rate position, which is lower than Biden's, she's plainly moderating.
But still raising capital gains taxes, Henrietta. Let's be clear, right? Still a higher level than they are now in the Biden administration.
It is in the Biden administration, but the Biden administration's budget is a 35% capital gains tax rate, and even ordinary income, which would rise to 37.9% as the Trump tax cuts expire. So certainly, compared to where the rates stand now, it's to the left, but not versus the far left spectrum of the Democratic Party.
And Henrietta, of course, we do have reaction from Donald Trump appearing on Fox and Friends this morning, saying that he's not inclined to debate Kamala Harris again. Do you think that's the correct move here? Do you think that that will ultimately help or hurt him when it comes to the next 2 months or so?
Well, you certainly don't want another losing debate, but I think what happens when you are the candidate that's on the decline is you want to shake things up. So there have been some folks on the Trump campaign team who have said that they will commit to a second debate, but Trump himself, as you point out on Fox and Friends this morning, says he was not inclined to do so, rejected that idea last night. But if they need to shake things up, you could see that through new policy platforms. What he's done in the past to stay on the tax conversation is he's dropped his platform from a 20% corporate tax rate to 15% to try to move further to the right. And you could see something on the policy side, or he could commit to another debate. I would be surprised at this point. And I think the Harris team wants the vice presidential debate on October 1st to be the next one. So they're probably going to get in a back and forth about the timing.
Henrietta, great to get your perspective. Really important to read your research. Henrietta Treyz joining us, Veda Partners. We appreciate it. Now, Of course, today marks the 23rd anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks here in the United States. Memorials are being held around the country, remembering and honoring the 2,983 men, women, and children killed in those attacks. And we're now heading to the next moment of silence in observance of when the North Tower fell in Lower Manhattan. And of course, it's accompanied by reading of the names of some of those we lost.
19. Uncle John, while I do not remember the 9 months I had with you, your accomplishments and personality have always been a constant in my life. When I see Boy Scouts, Marines, police officers, or firefighters, my thoughts go to you and your life of service. When I see acts of kindness, determination, and above all, loyalty, I think of you and everything my father and aunts have told me about your dedication to our family. I have grown in the light of your memory, and it has made me a better person. I hold these thoughts close today, and I say a prayer for you, as well as the other victims and their families. May you and every victim of this tragic day always be honored and remembered.
And my brother Anil Umarkar. Anil, today is your daughter Vomika's first day of graduate school. Please give her your blessings and keep smiling on her. And my husband Ganesh K. Ladkat. Honey, I love you. I miss you. You'll be happy to know that I'm married now to a wonderful man who's a volunteer firefighter in our town, takes care of me every single day. I love you and looking forward to seeing you soon.
This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's take a look at markets about an hour into the U.S. trading day because, boy, is it ugly. You take a look at the S&P 500 down about 1.5%. We are trading at session lows right now, of course, on the S&P 500 and on the NASDAQ 100. Big tech had been resilient up until this point. Now you can see sinking as well, falling in tandem on a day where you have incredible breadth to the downside. On the S&P 500, just 17 stocks in the green, and as you would expect, of course, you're seeing the volatility index, the VIX, rising as well, now trading with a 21 handle, and you're not exactly finding a haven when it comes to the bond market. 2-year Treasury yields had been higher, now they're pretty much flat on the day. Sonali.
And we welcome now our Bloomberg television and radio audiences, because joining us now is Howard Lutnick, who is the chairman and CEO of CANTOR FITZGERALD and BGC Group. CANTOR FITZGERALD lost 658 employees in the 9/11 attack and another 61 people at an affiliate, Euro Brokers. Howard lost his brother, Gary, in the North Tower. Gary was only 36 years old. He also lost his best friend, Doug, at 39. This is a heavy day for you, Howard. 23 years later, how do you honor them today?
So today, all of our employees
all of our employees waive their day's pay, and we ask our clients to do as much business as they possibly can, and this is our charity day. So all around you, everywhere around me are people donating every penny they make today to charities. We're going to raise about $12 million, and we're going to give it to 150 different charities around the world, because with these 5,000 people helping me, we're going to turn something horrible into something beautiful today.
I want to talk more about the legacy here, because one of Cantor's lawyers published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal overnight about how retirements at Cantor Fitzgerald are rare, given the firm had lost so many employees. And there are just so many employees now entering the workforce as well, Howard, who were not even born at the time of 9/11. How, in some ways, are you still building Cantor forward with that memory of 9/11 as such a big part of that Cantor story?
So, you know, these families are a part of us, and they stay a part of us. So we have a job offer out to all of the children of the people we lost. So just this week, we have a young lady joining us who worked for, who was born, basically her mother was pregnant right at 9/11, and now she's graduating college, and she's joining us. So we have about 36 children who work for us now, but we've had hundreds come, and it's been 23 years, so they move on with their careers. We train them, and we help them flourish in life. So these families are a part of us, and they are part of our DNA, and it's amazing and uplifting today. So at 4:30 today, we'll have a memorial, and we'll get together with all their families, and we'll read their names and put their pictures up. But we are together with these families, and the firm is together with them. And all these people, remember, we raised $180 million to take care of their families. And the way we did that is our employees waived 25% of their compensation and gave it to these families. So you know who has the best employees? I have at BGC, GFI, and Cantor Fitzgerald. I have the best employees.
Well, it's certainly an important moment in history, in American history, for you and for Cantor personally, so we appreciate you being here. But of course, it's also a big moment for the country, in our political history as well. And of course, you're in Lower Manhattan, and you're recently surrounded by former presidents, the current president, and of course, some presidential hopefuls there. So Howard, I'll ask you, what did you make of the debate last night between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris?
Well, before, this morning I went to the memorial for the reading of the names, and it was the most respectful thing. You had Kamala Harris, you had President Joe Biden, then you had Mike Bloomberg in the middle, and then you had Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, all there showing tremendous respect to the events of September 11th. You've got to understand that we've got to take out terrorism, and we've got to take out jihad. It has to end. It's got to be important to these people. And, I like that Donald Trump says he's going to return the hostages and take it to Hamas. I would like to hear Kamala Harris say the same thing. We've got to get the hostages out. We've got to crush Hamas, and we've got to crush jihad. We know jihad. We lost 658 people from Cantor. We lost 61 people from Eurobrokers. We've got to end jihad. Everyone in the United States knows it. Today's the day we remember it. It's got to end. We've got to end it on the earth.
I'll take then this opportunity to ask you, Howard, how you thought President Trump did in the debate last night. Of course, you have been named as one of the co-chairs of his transition team, were he to win. What did you think of his performance against Kamala Harris?
Well, look, I think Kamala Harris outperformed her expectations. I think she did a nice job. But Donald Trump, he hit every point. I mean, he hit every point. He stayed on immigration, which is unbelievable. I mean, why is the southern border open? He had it closed. Why, on the first day, did Joe Biden, with an executive order, open back up the border? I just don't understand why they would let all these people in, right? Inflation is huge and at an incredible high. So that first question, which is, are Americans better off? Kamala Harris told us a story about her upbringing because she didn't want to talk about the fact that prices for your groceries were up 50%. Gas is up 100%. The Inflation Reduction Act was really the Inflation Explosion Act. And so I think there were a lot of points to make. You can't make them all. I think he made a lot of them. And this is an incredible race. It's It's important for America, and I thought the debate was really important. If they have another one, I think that will be really important too. It'd be nice if the moderators didn't like get involved in the debate and make comments only against Donald Trump. That would have been better. But look, you can't help it. It is what it is. But I think it's great when they talk. I wish Kamala Harris would give press conferences and answer questions and show the country who she is. That would be really helpful and really important for the country.
Howard, you came out of the debate yesterday and you had betting markets swing very much in Kamala Harris's favor. And then on the other hand, you had Trump say that he's not inclined to head into another debate with Harris. Now, you, of course, are very close to Trump, have been a very prominent fundraiser. Do you think he should be leaning into a round two for a debate?
Well, you know, the thing about Donald Trump is he knows his debate. Like, if you think about me, I have maybe 100,000 followers, and he has 100 million followers. So I think I go with what he thinks. But look, I thought it's important for people to hear what she has to say. So to hear her out and to have her be out there and stop hiding in the basement and sort of get out there and talk. I think Donald Trump's got a lot to say. He's got a big plan. He's got a program, and he's got his record of 3% growth, 3% GDP growth, 3% wage growth, and under 2% inflation. So, I mean, he had a great record as president. But as I said, I'd like to hear her give press conferences. I'd like to hear her just answer questions in an open forum. How can you run and be president of the United States without answering questions in an open forum? It just doesn't make sense to me. But I think it's an amazing race. I think we have now, you know, it's exciting. And we all watched the debate last night. We all have our opinions. But obviously, I love when Donald Trump debates. I'd be happy if he did it again, but he knows better and he understands, and, you know, I'm on his side.
Howard, because you've been on his side, especially as a prominent donor as well, what does fundraising look like from here? It's really interesting to see the way that both corporate America and Wall Street has been shaping up against these two candidates. You have the Walton family members throwing a fundraiser for Harris in the near future. How do you counter that?
Well, I think, look, Donald Trump is fundraising. Kamala Harris is fundraising. I think, you know, the television airwaves are going to be incredibly crowded with advertising from both sides. And I think I don't think Donald Trump is having any trouble raising money. I don't think Kamala Harris is having any trouble raising money. So we can look forward to an enormous season of ads on television. But I think it's important to hear what the candidates have to say. The more they speak in their own voice, the better it is for America. As I said, Donald Trump is fearless. He went on ABC, which obviously was going to be against him because he's a fearless leader. I would like to see Kamala Harris show fearless strength and backbone and get out there and talk. I think if she got out there and talked, I think it would be great for America to hear her talk. How do you run for president and not get out there and talk? So I think the world should encourage her to get out there and talk, because I know Donald Trump is willing to take all takers, answer all questions, and get out there. And I think that's just basic.
And Howard, I'd like to talk about you a little bit, actually, and your role in, of course, the campaign, because last month you were named as co-chair of Donald Trump's transition team, should he win a second term, co-chair alongside Linda McMahon. How is that going? What are you focusing on right now?
Well, sort of the way transition works is if he doesn't win, then, it's not much. So what the campaign is focused on is winning, and I'll be focused on helping make sure that if he wins, there's an extraordinary administration around him. The scale of people who want to serve and are willing to serve far, far exceeds anything from 2016 and 2020, because now it's just a political race. That's all it is. You know, some people, more and more people come up to me and say they're supporting Donald Trump than ever before in my life. So I think the answer is you're going to see, if Donald Trump is elected, you're going to see the greatest group of administration and the greatest group of leaders enter this government. And I'm just helping him every way I can. But the key is he's got to win. Yeah. Transition isn't interesting unless he wins.
Totally get that's step one, of course, win. But are you talking to potential members of cabinet, for example? And if you want to name any names, we're all ears.
No, I'm not a, look, of course I'm talking to everybody. Of course we're going to do vetting. I mean, that is the job of running transition, is really to build a mosaic of incredible and capable leaders, both who've served in the government before and who hope to serve this time, and really set that all up so when he's won, then he can come in and take a look and build a great government. My job is to build a mosaic, and then he will be, of course, the commander-in-chief, and the chief is, let's design and build the government that is the strongest it possibly can. I think it's incredible that I get to play this role for him. It is the most exciting and most fun. I mean, I'm having a great time of it because I'm just helping him in a deep, respectful way, and it's going to be an amazing administration, but he's got to win first.
Are you worried, Howard, that if he loses, it'll be, as he's said on social media, a bloodbath? I mean, he said yesterday he had nothing to do with January 6th, but he clearly was encouraging all of his supporters to come and then go to the Capitol. His praise for Viktor Orban, his love of these big political rallies. Doesn't it concern you that
you gotta stop. You gotta stop. This
does it not concern you?
You know he said there'll be a bloodbath in the auto industry if they keep the NAFTA deal working and they let China build cars in Mexico and import them. You know that's what he said. So this concept, and the other concept that really made me unhappy was when Kamala Harris said that January 6th was the worst thing that happened to the country since the Civil War. See, today is 9/11.
I think the worst attack on the Capitol is what she said.
Was different.
The worst attack on the Capitol.
Well, how about the Pentagon? The Pentagon was a worse attack on the Capitol. So, I mean, come on. Stop the rhetoric of the nonsense, okay? In the debate, they could do that stuff. That's rhetoric and nonsense. When you have me on 9/11, let's just stay focused on 9/11, the events what happened 23 years ago, the attack on America. We've got to get rid of jihad. We all agree we've got to get rid of jihad, right? I'm worried about all these people coming into this country because I'm afraid terrorists have come into this country and they're going to do it to us again. And I never want any family to have to live through what I've lived through. I lost my brother Gary 23 years ago. He was 36. My best friend Doug. And if you could imagine, you look behind me at this trading floor, imagine them all being killed, because that's what happened 23 years ago. It'll crush your heart. It'll crush your soul. And to me, that's the most important thing about today. The most important thing about today is remembering these people, caring for their families, and making sure America stays strong and crushes terrorism around the world so no family has to have to go through what we're going through.
Howard, before we let you go here, you have pointed to an active trading desk very full of people. You've talked earlier in this interview about how you've been hiring more, you have been building. There's another moment coming up for you that I know that you are very much looking forward to. That is the launch of your new futures exchange with the backing from a lot of Wall Street giants. How is that going? What can you expect from day one? And are you concerned at all around any of the regulatory environment around it, given some of the clearing questions around London?
Okay, so Sonali, because I'm on your show, I'm going to tell you we are going to open our futures exchange on September 23rd. So the announcement of that was right here, right now, on your show. So we're opening our futures exchange, FMX, on September 23rd. And we are backed by the 10 largest trading firms in the world. Starts with JP Morgan and Citibank and Bank of America and Barclays and Wells and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and then Citadel, you all know, and then Jump and Tower, two firms you may not know, but they are the largest futures traders in the world. We're going to do rates futures, which is interest rate swap futures, which are called SOFR futures, and U.S. Treasury futures. We're going to start with SOFR futures, and that's going to start on September 23rd. And then in the first quarter of 2025, we're going to roll out Treasury futures, and we are going to create a break in the monopoly built by the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And it is so fun and so exciting. And you are right. I am completely jazzed about FMX. So FMX is owned by this company, BGC, which is the largest wholesale financial service company in the world. So we broker everything in the world that doesn't trade on an exchange. And on September 23rd, we open our fully approved CFTC futures exchange backed by the 10 greatest trading firms in the world. And I think we're going to bring competition to the market. And I am jazzed, jazzed, jazzed.
All right, you heard it here first. September 23rd, of course, FMX opens for business. Howard, we look forward to that launch, and we really appreciate your time today, of course. That is Howard Lutnick, Chairman and CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald and the BGC Group. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's get a check on these markets with, of course, the S&P 500 trading at session lows. We'll do that with Abigail Doolittle.
It is pretty brutal, Katie. Take a look at the S&P 500 E-mini futures overnight down slightly, holding flat. We even had a little bit of a positive trade today, but now, as you mentioned, at session lows down 1.6%. Now, from a superlative standpoint, it doesn't go back that very far, only because we've been in this bearish near-term stretch. It's the worst day since September 6th, ever since the last top back in earlier this year. It's been downward today. Adding to that, the S&P 500 futures now down on their 100-day moving average, telling you that the near-term buyers, they are out. Take a look at the Dow, the NASDAQ 100, the Russell 2000, and then the KBW Bank Index. There's really nowhere to hide. From a what standpoint, a fundamental standpoint, there are so many different things that you could point to. Post-debate, the uncertainty of the election. You could also point to the comments out of JP Morgan yesterday in terms of net interest income, really signaling the signs of the consumer that were confirmed by Ally Financial. Delinquencies on auto loans. The consumer, of course, 66% of GDP. I would argue there's one last factor here, though, as well, Matt. Let's take a look at oil, because oil today, last time I looked at least, things are moving quickly. This might have changed. It is slightly higher, but yesterday back down, WTI crude at 65. So this is a year-to-date chart. In blue, we have oil. In white, we have the XLE, or that spider, that energy spider. Right now, though, take a look at oil, down 8% on the year. There's a gap, but you can see that stocks and oil really trade pretty closely together, both risk assets. I would say that oil suggests that there's probably more downside. There's lots of signals around this out there, but I would suggest that oil, Matt, is saying that stocks, the XLE in particular, likely to go lower. Oil itself likely to go lower, which would confirm some of these mixed to possibly even negative tells that we're receiving right now on the state of the economy and the consumer here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see six handles on the crudes. I mean, they are up a little bit, but the global benchmark Brent crude is trading for less than $70 a barrel. WTI down under 66, as you just saw. Abigail Doolittle, thanks very much for that. Now let's get more on the inflation data that we saw. We're joined by Michael McKee, Bloomberg's chief international economics and policy correspondent, and the drop in oil, the drop in food prices that we've seen at the grocery store, that doesn't play into the core number, so that's why we saw it a little bit hotter at 0.3% month over month.
Well, the energy services are part of the core, but you're right, the drop in oil prices isn't going to make a difference, but it will down the road. And gasoline prices will make a difference in the headline down the road once they get incorporated into the September figures.
And the headline was 2.5% year over year.
Yeah,
so
energy has been dropping significantly. I think it was an 8% decline in the CPI today from the prior month. So that's not an issue really anymore, and neither is food. Food prices have flattened out. It's been the weird categories that have been going up and down, like airfares, and of course housing, that made the difference.
Yeah, well, in the minute we have left with you, I mean, we were talking to Omair, Sharif about the real feel of inflation, because all these categories, it's really mixed. You do have food costs flat, but you have airfares and housing costs higher. I mean, for the average consumer, inflation obviously is still a huge problem.
Although you don't buy a house every day, you don't buy a car every day. Everybody's experience with inflation is different, and that's why it's a little bit hard to say these are cost of living indexes, because everybody buys different things. And so you just have to keep an eye sort of on the trend here. And the trend is good. On a 3-month basis, we're really seeing inflation below 2% for the CPI.
All right, Mike McKee, thanks so much. And you know where the trend isn't good? That's in the
stocks.
Markets right now. You take a look at the S&P 500, and boy, it is a wipeout. The S&P 500 currently down about 1.6%. Big tech, no haven today, down 1.6% as well. Had been resilient earlier in the session. Not so much right now. And then you take a look at the small caps, really bearing the brunt of the selling, down 1.8%. But it's everywhere, guys. Everything is down.
Every major sector is down, led by financials, consumer, and energy. But to your point, you are not seeing any havens here.
Yeah, no, the sell-off just increased throughout the morning, throughout the program. Maybe it turns around in the afternoon. Stick with us through the close. Coming up tomorrow on Open Interest, iCapital Chief Investment Strategist Anastasio Amoroso joins us. This is Bloomberg.